Hello and welcome to Hopkins at Home. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Jonas Nahm. I'm an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, DC. I'm a political scientist. My research focuses on the politics of clean energy transitions. I do mostly work on China and Europe, but also on the United States. And today I'm talking about globalization, climate change, and clean tech supply chains in the age of COVID-19. You should all be seeing a little chat box at the bottom of your screen where you can type in questions, and I'm hoping to make this very interactive. So feel free to ask questions throughout, but I'm also leaving time at the end of my presentation to have a discussion with everyone afterward. So, let's make this a conversation rather than just me talking at you. This is a timely topic, climate change and the economic recovery. We're still in the midst of the COVID pandemic. California is on fire. The South is about to be hit by a hurricane. And so climate change and COVID and the recession are on everyone's mind. And so the question really is, can we combine an economic recovery with a prospect for fixing the climate problem at the same time? I was in China in January, actually, when the pandemic broke out, doing research on China's electric vehicle industry. And I was in Wuhan also in January and left China at the beginning of the Chinese New Year with everybody else who was traveling abroad. And a couple of days later, China was in complete lockdown. International flights were canceled. And so the pandemic had sort of taken hold in China at that time in full force. And very quickly, there was a lot of speculation on the internet and on Twitter, especially, about what this might mean for global carbon emissions and whether the recession and this sort of economic lockdown would actually have a beneficial effect. So very quickly, we saw a drop in a number of indices. Traffic went down, the air pollution in China sort of rapidly cleared up. Global air travel was shut down. And so as these lockdowns spread from China to other parts of the world, there was a lot of conversation about what this might mean for carbon emissions. And so these are just some indices pulled from the Financial Times. But if you were reading the newspapers at the time, there was a lot of conversation also about satellite-based images that were showing just that the air pollution in China, but also internationally, was decreasing very quickly during that time as a result of the shutdown, as people weren't traveling and using their cars. And so the question really is, what does the economic recession offer for climate change, but also what opportunity does it offer for fixing the problem in the long run? And so today I want to make sort of three arguments about COVID-19 and the economic recession and climate change. The first is that the emissions reductions that we've been seeing throughout the recessions really are very temporary and are much smaller than you'd think. The second fact that I want to talk about is that as countries are moving into recovery mode and are spending money on economic stimulus, the history shows us that the percentage of funds going towards climate change is likely going to be very small. And I'm going to show you some research that I've been doing with a team of Johns Hopkins students on stimulus packages that shows that in the current recession, that is also the case. And then the third fact, and that's drawing really on my research on China, is that COVID-19 is really undermining globalization, and that's bad for emissions because global clean energy industries are so crucial to fixing the climate problem. And any pushback against globalization also means that climate-related technologies are likely to be much more expensive than they used to be, and that's bad news for climate change. So let me dive right in. The first fact. So we were talking in January a lot about emissions reductions, and we've been talking about them ever since, but these emissions reductions are much smaller than you'd think, and they're likely to be temporary. Why am I saying that? One is that we've looked at past economic recessions, and every time we've had a recession, emissions dropped temporarily as economic activity shut down, but they didn't lead to any structural change in how the global economy works, and mostly have rebounded afterwards at a much steeper scale. And so that was the case during the oil crisis. It was the case after the collapse of the Soviet Union, during the Asian financial crisis, and it was also the case after the global financial crisis in 2009, 2008. And so if we were hoping that this sort of temporary drop in emissions would help us in the long run, I think that past recessions show us that that's not the case. Also, the emissions reductions are really much smaller than you think. So shutting down much of the global economy really will likely only amount to a 4% drop in global emissions during 2020. And so that's, for all the sort of human sacrifice that has gone into addressing COVID through these lockdowns, that's not a particularly large share of global emissions. And so if we think about how climate works, it's really about cumulative emissions in the atmosphere. It's not just about, an individual year. And so if we compare the overall concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and we factor in this 4 or 5% reduction that we're likely going to see this year, there basically is no difference. So we were projected to be at roughly 414.2 particles per million in carbon in the atmosphere at the end of this year. And so if we take 5% from this year out of that overall number, we're going to end up at 414.1 particles per million in the atmosphere. And so if we're thinking about sort of the impact that this one individual year is going to have on global climate, it's likely to be very, very small. The second fact, and I think that is another topic that has caused great optimism, is that green stimulus spending is likely to be very small. There's been a lot of conversation in the past couple of months, maybe not so much in the US, but in other parts of the world, about the economic recovery spending really presenting an opportunity for climate-related investments. And so these unprecedented stimulus funds that are being spent in the United States and elsewhere really could trigger, in principle, global investments in decarbonization through investments in green infrastructure, rapid transit, railways, electric vehicle charging stations, and so on, but also other stuff like retrofitting buildings that would spur jobs in the building sector and so on. And so really the question is what are countries doing to spur economic activity domestically, and is that going to be climate friendly? If we look at past economic recessions, and in particular the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, we're not likely to be very optimistic about an overwhelming climate push and stimulus spending. In the past great financial crisis, about 500 billion were spent on green projects globally. That was about 16% of global stimulus spending, and energy investments accounted for roughly 11% of global stimulus spending in that past recession. In the United States, we spent about 80 billion under the Obama administration as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And these numbers are based on sort of projected top line spending. We ended up spending overall much more on global recovery. And so the actual percentage of green stimulus was likely to be closer to 5%. And so in the past, we haven't had an overwhelming push in economic recovery. There's also always what I call sort of a carbon temptation. There's a temptation to fund construction projects, for instance, which can increase emissions rapidly. Cement is a huge contributor to the global climate problem. And that's what happened in 2010 when construction infrastructure projects increased global emissions in the recovery. And that a lot of that was coming out of China, but also elsewhere in the world. And in the current recession, we already see that the fossil fuel industries are also asking for bailouts and are also asking to be helped. China, in order to spur local economic growth, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, China had shelved a lot of coal power plant projects that now are being reactivated in order to spur local investment. And so that's creating carbon lock-in. Once we have the plant on the grid, it's going to be around for a long time. We've seen a lot of airlines in Europe asking for carbon taxes to be paused. German car makers have pushed back on climate targets and have asked for emissions goals to be pushed back in time. And in the United States, we've also seen a lot of stimulus spending going towards airlines and also the oil industry. A lot of the small business loans actually went to fossil fuel companies. And so there's a temptation not just to look at climate, but also at fossil fuels in these recessions. And in the past and in the current recession, that's also true. This is very preliminary data that I'm sharing here for the first time, but I've been working since March with a team of 6 Johns Hopkins students and my colleague Johannes Orpelainen and my colleague Scott Miller at the Whiting School of Engineering on trying to understand how countries are actually spending stimulus money in the current recession. And so we've been basically coding every single stimulus package in the G20 economies since the beginning of the COVID crisis, and looking at what percentage of it has gone to fossil fuel industries for compensation, how much it was invested in climate-related industries and policies, and how much was sort of neutral spending on, unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, and so on. And so far, what we find is that there hasn't been an overwhelming push on climate issues at all. We're basically right now spending about 5 to 5.5% on green stuff. About the same amount of money has been spent on bailing out fossil fuel sectors. And so there hasn't been an overwhelming push. There's some outliers. The European Union has passed or is in the process of passing a package that it has a big stimulus for green industries, particularly renewables and electric vehicles. But you can also see that a lot of countries have really rushed to bail out their fossil fuel industries. In Mexico, for instance, most of the stimulus spending went to the national oil company. And so there's been not an overwhelming trend here that leads me to be optimistic that we're actually using the recovery to invest in structural change in the economy that would allow us to decarbonize. In the United States, there hasn't been, certainly hasn't been an overwhelming push, but elsewhere is also pretty bleak. And that's the case across the board, including places like Germany that have been very sort of publicly advocating on climate action in the past. So the emissions reductions are relatively small from the recession, and we're not using the recovery currently to really change the game here. Which leads me to the third fact, and I think I want to spend a little bit more time on this because it's something that I think we often underestimate, and I think it's sort of publicly not being treated very well in the media. But COVID-19 is really pushing back against globalization, and I want to make the argument that that's really bad for emissions. And so that's sort of the third fact of the day here. In the immediate aftermath of the COVID crisis, there was a lot of concern about supply chains for protective equipment, for masks, and so on. And I think there was a big sort of global questioning of how reliant the world had become on China for manufacturing so many things that we need. But I think that really accelerated other trends that were already in place, sort of a pushback against globalization, a move to bring manufacturing back into national economies and to decouple from the Chinese economy. And so in many ways, the pandemic was exposing vulnerabilities that existed in global supply chains and has accelerated trends to reverse globalization. And I think that's been especially the case in the United States, but it's not only been the case in the United States. I think other countries have also started to reconsider their reliance and their relationship with China. And so why is this bad for climate? I think there are two reasons here. One is that we have false ideas about what manufacturing is about and the possibility of bringing it back very quickly in these global clean energy industries that we need to fix the climate problem. And the second is that we need to collaborate with China because China is currently making such a large percentage of global clean energy equipment. When we spend public money on climate policies, there's sort of a political logic at play here. Climate policy and green energy, clean energy industries and sort of green industrial policy requires vast fiscal and regulatory resources. So we spend public money, taxpayer money to incentivize behavioral change, to offset the cost of switching to new energy sources for consumers and for industries, and also to compensate the losers of these transitions, right? To compensate those that are losing jobs in oil and gas industries and that have to transition to new sources of employment. And so when we spend taxpayer money, for instance, to subsidize renewable energy, we want to see an economic return for it. And so governments have been very used to promising economic co-benefits as a result of climate policy. And so this need to build political coalition by promising these benefits has given manufacturing jobs in a special political status in these industries. Public funds are primarily offered for local goods, products, and services. And so we've seen a lot of protectionism in clean energy industries, especially. And so I think the US-China relationship is a good case here. We've seen trade barriers for Chinese solar panels, and we've seen local content regulation where, for instance, you only get a certain subsidy for solar panels if those solar panels were manufactured in a particular place. In North America, Ontario was the key example that has promised or has only given these subsidies to panels that were made in the province of Ontario. And so there's been sort of a pushback against globalization in these sectors historically, and that's being exacerbated at the moment. In the United States, if you look at state level regulations, there's been a lot of local content requirements. So you would only get benefits through these different renewable energy programs if you used locally manufactured equipment, if you used locally generated electricity, or if you grew local feedstock for biofuel, for instance. Internationally, we've seen a lot of countervailing duty and anti-dumping disputes, and sort of a pushback against Chinese dominance in these sectors. And I'm arguing that that's bad for climate because we don't actually know how to make a lot of these things in the rest of the world. And China has been such a key factor in allowing us to bring clean energy technologies to market quickly. So the question I'm asking really in my own research is, how do we avoid the manufacturing trap in the post-COVID stimulus packages? I'm arguing that fixing the climate crisis in the short run will require collaboration with China. China currently produces 66% of the world's solar panels. It makes about a third of the global supply of wind turbines. If you look at the actual components that go into wind turbines, China's share is much, much larger. And China is the largest supplier off and market for electric vehicles. Chinese firms currently make about 70% of the world's lithium ion batteries that we need for electric vehicles, that we need for grid storage to sort of offset the variability of wind and solar. And so China is a sort of central element of the global supply chain for the technologies that we need urgently to solve the climate crisis. To avoid the worst consequences of climate change, scientists estimate that we need to basically completely decarbonize the US transportation and electricity sectors by 2035. So that only leaves us 10 or 15 years to really turn this around. And so in that time frame, it's very unlikely that we'll be able to replace Chinese dominance in these sectors. But as COVID and the sort of pushback against globalization are leading us to not want to buy Chinese solar panels and wind turbines, I'm worried that that's going to delay deployment of these technologies, and it's also going to make it much, much more expensive. There's been a lot of conversation in the US about how sort of China stole renewable energy sectors. And I think that's not actually factually true. In my own research, I've shown that China really was the inventor of mass production in these industries. I don't know where you're all based and where you're calling in from, but if you drive from Los Angeles to Palm Springs through the valley, you see these huge wind turbine installations, and a lot of them are from the 1990s and 1980s. These were really cottage industries, and no one had really figured out mass production by the time Chinese firms entered these sectors in the early 2000s. So these were small production runs. There were lots of quality problems. If you look carefully as you drive through the desert there, you still see sort of burned out wind turbines lying on the side of the road. And so there were lots of problems in these sectors. We hadn't really figured out how to do this at scale. And so what China did in these sectors was really to invent mass production, to bring its existing skills and mass production to these new industries. And so you see that the global production runs of wind turbines and solar PV accelerated rapidly after China entered these sectors. And so as a result of this, we've seen incredible cost declines because of collaboration with China. The cost of wind turbines has gone down nearly 70% over the last 10 years, solar panels almost 90%. And so China's invention of mass production in these sectors really helped us bring down the cost. This doesn't mean that this was only a Chinese industry. I think there's been lots of collaboration. German manufacturers have made much of the production equipment on which Chinese firms have made these things. In the US, a lot of startups have worked with Chinese producers to bring their technologies to market. Companies like Applied Material equip Chinese factories in these industries. And so China's been sort of a critical hub in bringing these technologies to market, but it wasn't the only player that benefited from this. We all benefited from this because the cost came down, but lots of firms were able to work with China on bringing these technologies to market. And I'm not saying that there aren't problems, that the playing field is completely level in China, but I think we often underestimate the benefits that many have had. And so these cost declines because of collaboration with China have been critical. And one of the key problems that I see with this current pushback and sort of this move to be more nationalistic or mercantilistic in trade policy as a result of longer term tendencies, but also accelerate as a result of the COVID recession, would really cut against us taking advantage of China's contribution to this field. And so I want to spend the last couple of minutes of my talk, and I'm really hoping to jump into Q&A in a couple of minutes to talk about sort of the three lessons that I see here. The first lesson is one that is really about demonstrating the sort of scale of the climate challenge. If you think about how small the current emissions reductions are, it also shows you that just locking down the global economy does very little to actually solve this problem. And so what we really need to be thinking about is how current emissions reductions can help us understand what we need to do in the longer term. And that really means structural change in the economy. I also think that sort of linking the current economic crisis to climate change is problematic for political reasons, because we don't want to associate good climate policy with economic suffering, and it doesn't have to be associated with that. Making structural change in the economy, shifting to different sources of fuel, decarbonizing transportation, power sectors, and so on, can create jobs, and it can help us make a much more sustainable transition to a clean economy, essentially. And so the sort of hype about the current emissions reductions really was misplaced, and I think in many ways is politically destructive for us going forward. The second lesson that I see here is that the green stimulus is an opportunity, but it won't get us around the politics. As I've shown you in the sort of preliminary data from this ongoing research that's happening at Hopkins, we're not using the opportunity right now to shift the economy in the ways that I've just outlined. And part of that is that it's not a priority in many countries right now to fix the climate problem, even as California is on fire and there are hurricanes coming down the Gulf of Mexico. What we need to be doing is thinking about how to take these stimulus investments and channel them in more productive ways. If there's any pattern that I see in the data for the current stimulus packages, it's really that we've mostly spent stuff on neutral things to shore up the economy, but haven't really seen sort of a shift towards clean investment. And there are lots of things that we could be doing. We have an old Amtrak system. We could be building high-speed rail between Washington, D.C. and Boston. We could be retrofitting homes, making them more energy efficient. All of that would create lots of jobs. We could install electric vehicle charging stations along America's highways, or give people a premium to buy electric cars in the current recession. So there are lots of ways that we could stimulate the economy while also helping people transition to new kinds of jobs, less energy consumption, and more cleaner sources of fuel. And then the third lesson that I see here really is that if we have any hope of preventing the worst consequences of climate change, we need to find a way to work with China. And the current political climate is really pushing against that kind of collaboration. under the Obama administration, climate was one of the few areas where the US had a good relationship with China. And I think it really helped also discuss more controversial topics. But US-China collaboration was critical in getting the Paris Agreement passed and to create sort of consensus behind the need to address this globally. But the Paris Agreement was just the beginning. It was designed to be sort of a first attempt for us to get together and set climate goals for ourselves, for every country individually, and then hold each other accountable as we go forward. But it was also designed that we would meet every couple of years globally and accelerate our goals and set tougher goals and move faster. And as the US-China relationship is sort of falling apart currently at an unprecedented pace, that kind of dynamic is no longer there. And it's not really clear that there's anyone else who's taking that role. China domestically has been worried about the kind of economic fallout of the sort of unprecedented decline in the US-China relationship and trade wars and so on, and has instinctively, I think, reverted back to relying on some of the tried and true industries of the past, including the coal power sector. And so that is not really helping. And then I think finally, one of the most sort of interesting things is that we basically have not really developed a replacement for China in these global supply chains. And so for all of the technologies that we have available currently that we could use tomorrow, we need China to make these things. And so in the short term, we certainly cannot replace China in these supply chains. I think that in the longer term, there's things we can do to maybe shift the balance a little bit. And I don't think it's inevitable that China will dominate these industries forever. But the problem, particularly in these clean energy sectors, is that we have such limited time available to us. We're basically burning through our carbon budget if we haven't burned through it already. And so in order to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, we really need to figure out a way to work with China in the short term and open trade relationships so that we can use Chinese wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, and whatever else. And I think it could be a way to also improve the relationship in other areas, but currently we're not doing any of those things. And I don't think that's necessarily just a sort of Republican problem. I think that there's a kind of broad consensus in Washington, DC currently that China sort of not really follow the rules of the game, and so that economic decoupling is probably a good thing, but particularly in the climate sector, this is a huge problem. I'm seeing that there are questions already coming in, so I think I'm going to wrap up my part of the talk here, and I'm going to start to talking about some of the questions that are coming from you guys. So thank you so much. So I'm getting one question from Toby: with so much doubt placed on the validity of data by government decision makers, where do you think the focus should be placed to inspire the most immediate change? I think that's a really interesting question, because we're all living through climate change already. And so in many ways, we don't really need to use government data in many ways to understand the severity of the problem. If you live in Oregon right now, I think it's very easy to understand what the current impact is. I think it's also important for us to understand that we currently are at 1 degree warming. So climate change has already progressed, right? So we can measure that. We're on track to get to 4 or 5 degree warming if we don't drastically change our economic behavior. So if we're looking at sort of this unprecedented conglomeration of sort of weather events and climate events that we haven't ever seen before, that's only going to get stronger. And so I think it was much harder to convince people politically, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, when we weren't seeing these grave consequences yet. I'm hoping, and I think that's really our last hope, is that politically people will come around to making immediate change. In terms of what changes we need to make, I think we need to basically decarbonize everything. And so that means everyone individually can contribute to this, but we also need to set broader political goals that we haven't been setting. We did, for instance, pass stricter vehicle emissions legislation in 2009 after the last financial crisis. There's been a lot of pushback against these rules currently. I don't think that's going to help the auto industry competitively. I think it's not going to make American car manufacturers able to sell more cars internationally, but it's also sort of setting us back, right? And so I think we definitely need a central government federal role here in terms of making these kinds of changes. Dan is asking what I see as the top opportunities for private industry and startups to make an impact in these times. I think that's a really interesting question. I think the US historically has been incredibly strong at innovation, and that many of these technologies that I was talking about actually come from US startups and US universities that then sort of spun off their technologies into individual startups. One challenge has been, I think, that we don't really know very much about manufacturing in this country anymore. And so these startups have had a hard time commercializing their technologies domestically. So one thing that we need to be doing, and I think there again is a government role, but it's a role also for sort of US innovators and startups, is to find better ways to work with China to commercialize some of these technologies in the short run. So this might be new battery chemistries that are better than the current lithium ion technologies for many applications. This might be new kinds of solar technologies that have been developed in the US and could be commercialized. And then there's sort of broader business model problems, right? So it's not just about manufacturing technologies, but it's also about setting good incentives for consumers to do things differently. So one US innovation, for instance, has been this idea of solar leasing, which means that you basically rent out your roof space and a company installs the solar panels for you, then pays you a fee, but you don't have to shoulder the upfront cost. And so these kinds of business model innovations, I think, are something that the US historically has been very strong at, and that make climate action much more accessible for individual consumers and much more comfortable and reasonable. And so I think these kinds of things, I think, should be the focus of the US private sector, and I think they can play a huge role here. How do we deal with the time horizon Jesse's asking in climate policy, where states agree to big investments in climate while climate change continues to get worse for 30, 40 years? How much is baked in already? I mean, the situation is that the current climate is probably the coldest climate we'll see in our lifetimes. What we have currently in the atmosphere is going to stay in the atmosphere for at least 100 years. And so that's a scary prospect if you're looking at the fires in California, where the fire season hasn't actually started yet. So yes, a lot of it is baked in already, but I think that should encourage us to do more to avoid further climate pollution. And I think that's basically where we need to focus. What we also need to think about is how much are we locking in fossil fuels through current policy. And so that's why the economic stimulus currently is such an important issue. So if we're building new natural gas pipelines, if we're building new coal power plants or bailing out oil companies, we're basically baking in carbon emissions for a long time. A power plant runs for 60 years. So if we're building a new one now, we better make sure that it's what we need in 60 years and for 60 years, because otherwise we face this problem of stranded assets and strong interest groups that are pushing back against climate change. So I guess my response to that question is that it's complicated. We've already done a lot of damage, but that should not demotivate us. I think it could get a lot worse. We need to be very careful about the decisions that we make now in order to avoid further lock-in. Chris is asking, are countries including domestic source requirements like Buy American in their COVID recovery and clean energy packages, and are they likely to have considerable effects? How so? So far, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that that's happening, but that is for the reason that we haven't actually seen a lot of evidence that countries are using this situation to actually invest in clean energy technologies. China is sort of proposing, for instance, to update its highways as a sort of response to the economic recession, and is looking at installing electric vehicle charging stations along all major highways in the recovery. I'm pretty sure that that's going to be a Chinese technology. I think that there's a sort of temptation to do that elsewhere. The advantage that China has is that it's making these technologies, and it's probably smart for them to use them. For us, we could incentivize, for instance, solar rooftop installations, and to then attach that to local content requirements would make it more expensive and also more difficult for consumers to source. So we haven't really seen that yet, because we haven't really done anything on climate in the current recession. But I think if we look at sort of the history of green energy or sort of green industrial policy around the world, there's always been the temptation to attach it to these kinds of local content requirements. A lot of them are illegal under WTO regulations, but the problem is that it takes so long to run a course through the WTO that the damage is usually done by the time the ruling comes out. And so we need to avoid that going forward, and I think be much more realistic and conscious about how and why and when we need to collaborate with China and when we need to push back. Liz is asking, what responsibilities do businesses have who rely on the delivery model to address climate impacts, especially during a time when many people are relying on delivery for health reasons? I don't really know what the actual emissions impact is. I mean, we're probably currently using less energy because we're not all driving to work in the same way as we did before. And so it might be more efficient to have people come to us rather than everyone sort of traveling every day for work reasons. But yes, I think there are emissions impacts from the delivery model. One of the good things is that it's concentrated in a number of companies, and those companies can make commitments to switching to electric vehicles. Uber has, I think, announced a day, I think it's 2030, that they've committed to having a full electric vehicle fleet. I know that the German Postal Service, for instance, has developed its own electric vehicle technology to switch its delivery vehicles to electric. And so companies like UPS and FedEx can play a big role in reducing emissions from the sort of current crisis. I think one of the problems that we're seeing, and I've had many conversations with car manufacturers about this, is that, of course, car sales are going up because people don't want to use public transit in a pandemic. But people are also, again, much more concerned about range. And so where we had much improvement on the range of electric vehicles in recent years, now that people are switching to road trips because they don't want to get on airplanes, there might be a possibility that they're not choosing electric cars as they're replacing their existing vehicles in the current pandemic. And so I think it's too early to tell how this is all going to play out. I know that some of the car manufacturers are now talking about, they're doing sort of advertising that if you have an electric car, you never actually need to go to the gas station, and so you don't need to handle the pump. And so that's sort of a pandemic advertising for charging your car at home. But it's a little too early to tell. I think it could well be that we're using more delivery and we're driving instead of using trains and buses to get around. And so that wouldn't be helpful. Susie is asking, how much will this upcoming election impact the US and global path towards decarbonization? I think the upcoming election is absolutely critical. I think the current Trump administration has not really taken climate change seriously at all. Trump was in California yesterday saying that at a press briefing that the climate will soon cool again. That's sort of the same statement that he made about COVID in March, that it would just go away. And in the aftermath of the Trump election, there was a lot of discussion in the US about the action of local governments, of cities and state governments to step up, and many vouched that they would uphold the goals of the Paris Agreement through their policies domestically. The problem is that we really need all levels of government to play along here. And so if DC doesn't join the fight, we won't be able to achieve the kinds of emissions reductions that we need to do. And so, a lot of this also depends on sort of local context. If you think about Los Angeles has a municipal power utility, so they have some control over what kind of power they source and what kinds of power plants they build, but New York City doesn't. And so if we think about sort of the role that cities can play, there's a huge variation in what kinds of levers they have and what kinds of tools they have available for them. And so for those cases where the cities or the states don't have the tools, we need the federal government to help do this. In terms of sort of the broader global context for this question, the US and China together make up 40% of global carbon emissions. And so even if the rest of the world accelerated, did everything they could to decarbonize, we probably wouldn't get to the goals that we need to get to. And so that's why I think the US-China relationship is so incredibly important for this problem. And these sort of hostilities that are happening currently are not helping at all. So in that case, I think a Biden administration might not be very China friendly, but I think it would take climate policy much more seriously and maybe also make some pragmatic decisions about what issues to work on with China. And I think, and I'm hoping that climate change would be one of them. Kat is asking, what does the academic community do about climate change other than measuring and reporting their findings? Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, that's sort of our job, right, is to measure and report the findings. I think we've all become a lot more aggressive about public outreach and trying to make sure that our findings are not just published in academic papers, but find their ways into op-eds, into newspapers and television shows. And so I think that's been a big part of the kind of environmental politics community in recent years, to make sure that this isn't just something that is discussed in the academic community, but that that goes out to the world. We're obviously also teaching our students, and hopefully they will take good lessons from the classes that we teach on these issues and sort of amplify the impact. I think in terms of sort of actual impact of our research activity on climate, there's been a lot of conversation about when travel is necessary, how many conferences one needs to attend a year. I think that's been much more aggressive in Europe. I know that, for instance, Danish universities are setting a sort of carbon budget for their academics. So you can only do so many trips a year to international conferences that are funded through the university. So there are attempts to sort of actually, reduce the impact of our own research on climate as well. Isabel's asking why we don't partner with Mexico to use its manufacturing capacity to reduce reliance on China, particularly because of Mexico's lithium resources. I think that's a great question. I mean, so what I was trying to say is that we currently are sort of locked into this China relationship for the short term, right? In the next couple of years, it's unlikely that we can sort of replicate what China has built here, because there's so much knowledge and innovation that's gone into this mass manufacturing infrastructure in China, and they've really started working on this 30 years ago. So, in 5 years, we won't be able to catch up in quite the same way. But yes, we can invest in alternatives. And one of the problems in Washington is always that everyone likes to blame China for everything it's doing. So China's taking over the electric vehicle market, China's taking over the battery market, but we're not really coming up with strategies in the long term to offer an alternative. And so one thing we could do is partner with other countries, of course, like Mexico, and build on their manufacturing capacity. I think the trade relationship there has also been somewhat complicated in recent years. But I think what we should think about ultimately is why we've had such a decline in manufacturing in this country. These factories in China are fully automated. It's not like this is a labor cost issue. I think a big problem is that the US financial system hasn't been lending to manufacturing. So we are hoping that startups get funding through venture capital, and venture capital needs returns on investment on a much shorter time frame. And so one of the things we can do, I think, is think about setting up a national infrastructure bank, for instance, that would lend to manufacturing businesses in this country to establish these supply chains here. We can invest in vocational training and technical colleges, community colleges to train a manufacturing workforce that could do this here. There are many things we can do to sort of create jobs in these industries here. And I'm not saying that this is sort of a foregone conclusion that China will dominate these things forever. The problem is that we haven't really, as a nation, done much recently to try to do that. And so if we start now, we're still going to be reliant on China for the foreseeable future, because it'll take some time to get there. Carl is asking what role the investment management industry along with civil society will play in accelerating in accelerating public policymakers towards addressing climate change. I think that the financial sector is going to play a huge role. If you think about the amount of money that is invested in essentially industries that are going to become obsolete as a result of climate policy and as a result of climate change, there's going to be a huge push from these sectors to try to find solutions. If you think about how many public pension funds are invested in oil companies that are now losing money because demand for oil is declining, these kinds of things are going to be hugely important, I think, in accelerating sort of the public awareness on this issue, and also sort of making sure that policymakers know the urgency of this case. And so divestment strategies where portfolios are removing their assets from fossil fuel are important, but they're also important because they send a sort of political message that investments in further fossil fuel and the sort of carbon lock-in that comes with this is not a smart economic strategy going forward. Varap is asking, how has COVID deferred planned investment in climate mitigation adaptation? Has it deferred it or canceled capital project, postponed because of wildfires and the current hurricane season? I think COVID has certainly shifted attention away from the urgency of climate. I think it's sort of rolling back now because of the current situation. I think where I see the biggest impact is sort of this idea that good climate policy is bad for the economy, and that in the current COVID recession, we need to do everything we can to shore up the economy, so climate comes second. And so these are exactly the kind of policies where we defer environmental regulation, for instance, emission standards, suspend certain climate goals, thinking that they will help our companies recover faster. I think in the long run, that's a really bad strategy, because they also will make our companies less competitive, especially on international markets that are taking this problem much more seriously. Beth is asking if there are ways that we can support changing energy resources used in developing countries to be more climate friendly and support their economic growth. I think that's a huge untapped opportunity for Western countries. I think China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, has really rolled out a grand strategy to spur investment in other developing economies, and has seen that as a way to develop international markets for its firms. We haven't really had a similar strategy to counter it. The problem with the Belt and Road Initiative that China is running is that it's sort of more an umbrella of different policies rather than a kind of key strategic initiative. And so it hasn't really set any climate-related goals. China's been saying that if countries want to import coal power plants from China, that's fine. If they want to buy solar installations, that's also fine. And so it's been sort of agnostic on the climate impact of its investment strategies abroad. What would be really helpful for the world would be if Europe and North America got together and started a similar sort of outward investment programs, maybe through a financing institution that would lend money for clean energy investment in developing economies. I think a lot of developing economies are investing in clean stuff. So it's not just sort of advanced industrialized economies. In the past couple of years, the developing world has overtaken the West in its investment in clean energy, but much more needs to be done. And we're already seeing the sort of the sort of complicated politics of this. As countries get richer, energy demand goes up. And so, if the Indian middle class is now all buying air conditioning, it's going to be a huge problem for global climate if we don't figure out a way to fuel that power demand with clean sources of energy. And I think a key obstacle has been financing. And so if we have the technologies that we can invest, bring to these countries, but we can also offer ways to fund the investment, that would, I think, accelerate investment in clean energy in developing economies. Let me go. So Anupam is asking how public-private partnerships play a role in fixing the climate problem. One of the key ways that public-private partnerships have, around the world been very helpful for climate has been, for instance, in investing in public transit. A lot of China's subways are public-private partnerships, essentially. And so if we can use this relationship to accelerate investment in clean clean technologies and clean infrastructure and clean energy resources. I think that's one key way in which we can do that. On sort of a less of an investment level, I think that the business, sort of the private sector, plays a huge role in also forging a change in policy and pushing for this. And so we're now seeing finally sort of a bigger push from the business sector for smart climate policy, just because they're seeing the outfall from all these climate disasters already, for the insurance policy, for the sort of local economies and so on. And so if private firms can make commitments to decarbonizing their own business operations and making public support for certain policies dependent on their climate impact, I think that would also bring us a lot further. So far, the utility industry and sort of fossil fuel have been hugely obstructive and have basically made it impossible to pass a lot of climate policies in this country and elsewhere in the world. So historically, the sort of private sector response has been against climate policy, and so that really needs to change. As we see growing renewable energy sectors, growing industries that are dependent on clean energy technologies to survive, I'm hoping that this balance of interests will shift over time, and we'll have a better lobby on the other side to ask for stronger climate policy. But historically, that's not really been the case. Tia is asking if there's a growing awareness of utilizing newer technologies to help conserve our finite supply of water, especially with the growing need for cooling data centers and medical facilities for research and care. I'm not an expert on the water sector. Water is becoming the next big problem in the world, and sort of the next sort of finite resource that we'll all be fighting about. I think the American West is experiencing this acutely at the moment already, but it's also happening elsewhere in the world just as a result of different climate patterns. Historically, a big push, or sort of one technology that we've used to fix water shortages has been desalination, which again, you can do using clean sources of fuel, or you can use fossil fuels to do so. And so I think there are technological options to both sort of create new water supply in different parts of the world, but we need to make sure that we actually use them. And so if water becomes an acute problem in Australia, for instance, building big desalination plants could be hugely detrimental to climate unless we use these new technologies. And so I think that's sort of where I've seen the strongest pushback. But you can also see water becoming a problem for the fossil fuel industry itself. So they rely on cooling for their power plants. They need water from rivers and lakes in order to cool power plants. And there are interesting studies out there showing how many global fossil fuel power plants are at risk of water shortages. A couple of summers ago, France and Germany had to shut down a lot of fossil fuel power operations because there was no water to cool them in a big drought. And so these kinds of sort of vulnerabilities are also becoming more apparent, and wind turbines and solar panels do not require water for cooling, and so leave that water to be used for other resources. Kat's asking if I could comment on Trump's skepticism and science in general, especially climate science, and how that could be addressed. That's something I've been kind of struggling with and thinking about a lot during the pandemic. I think that the sort of skepticism in scientific input in the COVID response has been very obvious to people. And interestingly, we now see the same sort of skepticism in his response to climate. I don't know how that could be sort of addressed, other than a change in government directly. But I do think that this sort of puts a lot of responsibility on science itself to not rely on the government to broadcast its message, but for us to go out there and try to explain our findings and our research directly to the public. And so I think that it's sort of the only way that I can see that we can do that. I'm hoping that the sort of discrepancy between what's coming out of these public statements, these sort of anti-scientific statements, and the effects of them and the sort of reality that we're all seeing on the ground every single day. I mean, I'm in Washington, D.C., and I can see the haze that's blowing from the wildfires in California. I'm hoping that the sort of discrepancy between these different realities is making people realize that, the reality is out there and it's not going to be changed by political games that are being played in D.C. And I'm hoping that that will sort of lead people to ultimately trust the experts rather than those trying to seek re-election and sort of play political messages here. I think we're running out of questions, so we're almost out of time also. So I thank you all for coming, for listening to me, for asking good questions and then sort of interacting with me. I wish we were all in the same room, but eventually we'll be able to do that again. So thank you for joining us at Hopkins at Home today. And I hope you all have a great day. Be safe.